Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about China and the rise of communism in China, and then talk a little bit about World War II as well. So when we last talked about China in week 3 of this module, we were talking about the rise of nationalism in China led by a man named Sun Yat-sen. How Sun Yat-sen introduces the Western ideas of nationalism into China, overthrows the last Chinese imperial dynasty, and establishes a republic in 1921. Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, and his successor as leader of the Nationalist Party, which is known as the Kuomintang, is a man named Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek wants to maintain the republic, he wants there to be nationalism, but he also wants to maintain traditional Chinese values, such as Confucianism and Confucianist values. And so Chiang Kai-shek is more conservative than Sun Yat-sen. Around 1927, so about 2 years later, civil war breaks out between the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists, and the emerging Chinese Marxist party, or the Chinese communists. And initially, the nationalists are successful. They drive the communists down into the southern part of China. They have them penned up there, and they're gradually eliminating them. One band of Chinese communist fighters, led by a man named Mao Zedong, managed to escape from the encirclement. And they escaped from the nationalists deep into northern China in what's known as the Long March of this group across China. And so it's a defeat. They had to retreat. But the propaganda of a long march, the struggle across some of the most difficult terrain of China, establishes something of a propaganda victory for the communists. It establishes Mao Zedong as the unquestioned leader of communism in China. And finally, it eliminates the power of local warlords, because as the Chinese communists are coming through, they defeat these warlords. And this had been a problem for the Chinese for a long time now. A big barrier to true centralization and unification of China had been these local warlords who refused to obey the authority of the central government. And so the end result in the early 1930s in China is that the communists have an established leader. China is poised for a unification, and that China is also about to come under attack. And 1931 is the beginning of what's known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, when the Japanese invade China and attack the nationalists, because the nationalists are the government who are in power. Now, what we think at the moment is that the Japanese who had added Korea, Manchuria, and Taiwan to their areas under their control, the areas that were part of their empire, that they really wanted access to Siberia, that they wanted to make Siberia a big part of their empire because of its incredibly rich resources in raw industrial materials and natural gas. And so they had entered into an alliance with Nazi Germany, and they imagined that both they and the Nazis would attack the Soviets, and that the Japanese could carve out a large empire in Siberia. But what they find instead is that the Nazis have actually signed a treaty with the Soviets. And so because the Japanese don't feel that they can take on the Soviets by themselves, they instead begin to look south. And they invade China in a brutal invasion, recognizing that China is divided after years of civil war, and seeking to expand their territory into Southeast Asia, where there is also a rich supply of raw materials. And so this is actually going to weaken. The big result of this war is that the nationalists in China, who seemed on the verge of totally defeating the Chinese communists, are actually going to be weakened. They're going to be weakened because they're being defeated by the Japanese, who have a powerful and cutting-edge army. And at the same time, they're losing morale. And at the same time, the communists are actually getting stronger. So the communists are going to come out of World War II much stronger because, in part, the nationalists have been fighting against the Japanese. And so the Japanese begin their expansion into Southeast Asia. And remember that the United States had already begun to be worried about Japan's rising influence in the Pacific. And so the Japanese felt that they needed to establish a perimeter. They needed to establish a perimeter of islands from which they could defend themselves against the United States. And so they launched a surprise attack against the most western outpost of the United States, the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This is a very famous attack. The surprise is complete. Much of the American Navy, much of the American Air Force in the Pacific is stranded on the ground and destroyed. The Americans had never received a declaration of war from the Japanese, and so this made the Americans feel particularly aggrieved by this surprise attack. Fortunately for the Americans, their aircraft carriers were not attacked during the attack on Pearl Harbor, were not damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor because they were away on training. And the Japanese were too afraid of where they might be and that the Americans might launch a counterattack and so they didn't try and find them. And they actually called off the attack on Pearl Harbor early when they could have done more damage. This is really crucial for the United States because it means they have a force to fight on with while they're bringing their great industrial might into play. Because the Japanese know that they have to establish this defensive perimeter quickly, then they can try and win a defensive war against the United States. They know that if they're going toe-to-toe against the United States, in the end they're going to be defeated. And initially, again, they are successful. They're successful defeating the French, the Dutch, and the British in Southeast Asia until the Americans win an unexpected victory at the Battle of Midway. This victory is based on American intelligence, their ability to crack Japanese codes, and American work ethic. That the Americans are able to repair one of their aircraft carriers, which had been badly damaged in a previous battle, in order to be ready for the Battle of Midway. And this confuses the Japanese and gives the Americans more firepower. So the Americans win this Battle of Midway, and this marks the turning point of the war. From this point onwards, the Americans will continue to outproduce the Japanese, and eventually to finally defeat them with the use of the atomic bomb in 1945. This brings World War II to an end, with the Japanese Empire in ruins. When World War II ends, the Japanese are instructed to surrender to the Americans and the British. However, many of them surrendered to the Russians who had moved into Manchuria when they saw that the Japanese were defeated. The Russians seize the weapons they receive from the Japanese and give these to the Chinese communists, who are invigorated from a period of not being attacked, who are now fighting against the nationalists, who are no longer receiving much of the American aid they had received before, and who are weakened by fighting against the Japanese. And so the Chinese communists are able to defeat the nationalists, who they drive off, and the nationalists flee to Taiwan and establish a separate government there. And the Chinese communists achieve the full unification of China under a communist government in 1949. So now we're heading into the Cold War, the beginnings of the Cold War. When Japan surrendered, its first province of its empire, Korea, had been divided into two, a northern half and a southern half. The northern half quickly comes under communist influence and, encouraged by Stalin, attacks the southern half in 1950, beginning the Korean War. The West had always expected that the next conflict would be a nuclear conflict, and so when this conflict was made with limited weapons, conventional weapons, they were initially caught off guard. But in the end, they are able to successfully launch a landing, the Americans and the United Nations. They launch a landing on the Korean peninsula behind the North Korean army, threatening to trap them. And so the North Korean army is driven back. But instead of just re-establishing the boundaries, the Americans and the United Nations attempt to defeat North Korea for once and for all and reunite Korea from the south. However, to the Chinese at the time, only a couple of years after their communist victory, this looks like the beginnings of an American plot to bring back the Chinese nationalists who had fled to Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek. And so the Chinese enter the war on the side of the North Koreans. They have a very brutal war. Many of the prisoners of war die in captivity or are abused. We have very cold conditions in the winter. The war itself bogs down into a stalemate. After Stalin's death in 1952, the two sides come to an armistice. So they come to a ceasefire, but hostilities remain just beneath the surface in North and South Korea even to this day. Communist policies in North Korea establish a superstate where the government is all powerful and where the country is very poor. By contrast, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong all embrace capitalism tied to Confucian work ethic and Confucian values of work. And all of these countries experience booming economies and become some of the most powerful economies in the world. And so this is where we're going to leave East Asia, the end of our course. The rise of capitalism in Eastern China that has made these countries very powerful. The challenge on the horizon of falling birth rates, especially in Japan. The decline in the Japanese population suggests a major economic challenge for that country in the years ahead.